Dealing with regret for scapegoat survivors of narcissistic abuse. So in the comments from an earlier video on what to do after gaining distance from narcissistic abuser, someone posted this. They said, and the name of the commenter was called YouTube Google. But anyway, the comment was, Jay, could you do a video about regret, not living to full potential in the past due to narcissistic abuse and feeling like you lost your best years? Well, I thought this was a very important point and topic. Based on the number of replies to that comment, it looks like a lot of other people did too. The fact is that if you had a narcissistic parent, then the ways you had to adapt to survive such treatment while staying in relationship to that narcissistic parent likely made it impossible to live life to your full potential at that time. And this commenter, YouTube Google, raises the important question of how to cope with the loss of this time once you're in recovery from such abuse. I think an unfortunate consequence of having to endure such a difficult quality of life can be the experience of regret. And I'm going to define regret as the feeling of disappointment in oneself for doing or not doing something in the past. And I'm going to contrast regret with grief. And grief is a deep sadness felt due to a significant loss. As I mentioned before, I had a dear friend who would differentiate dirty pain from clean pain. And to applied here, I'm going to submit to everyone that regret might fall in the category of dirty pain, while grief is what I would call clean pain. And in today's video, I'll discuss some common sources of regret for survivors of narcissistic abuse. Next, I'll describe how regret may reflect a way of going along with a survivor's belief that he or she is in fact defective. And I'm going to then challenge that assumption of control, which may underlie a survivor's experience of regret. And that'll make more sense as we go along. Last, I'm going to describe how regret might be transformed into grief and the essential role of safe, close relationships to effect such a transformation. Well, my name is Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I specialize in helping people recover from narcissistic abuse. So this form of abuse can leave us feeling lost and estranged from our basic sense of who we are. In individual therapy and in my online course on recovery from narcissistic abuse, I try to offer a map that allows survivors to come back to the quality of life that somewhere in themselves they very much know they deserve. And of course, each person has to kind of travel their own path, but this kind of broad stroke map can be helpful in navigating that path. And I see there as being three essential features to this map, which I'll call the 3 pillars to recovery. The first pillar is making sense of what happened so you get to know that it was not your fault. The second pillar is gaining psychological, emotional, and sometimes physical distance from the narcissistic abuser and or the narcissistically abusive system. The third pillar involves living in defiance of the narcissist rules. And lastly, you can't do this in a vacuum. I think it's simultaneously essential to find and participate in communities and relationships with people who can get, validate, and support you on this path. So today's video falls under pillar number 1, making sense of what happened. And all these videos are organized into playlists which correspond to these 3 pillars if you want to really dig into one or more of the pillars and kind of have a theme kind of continuous along those lines. And I want to point you to another, I think, great resource to help with that pillar number 1 of making sense of what happened to know it was not your fault. And that's my free ebook called Surviving Narcissistic Abuse as the Scapegoat. You can find the link to the ebook in the description below or by clicking here. So why survivors of narcissistic abuse can feel regret? Researchers divide regret into 2 buckets: disappointment in oneself for what one has done, and disappointment in oneself for what one has not done. I'm going to list some of the common sources of regret for survivors of narcissistic abuse that I've encountered, and this list is by no means exhaustive, but I would encourage you to put your own sources of regret which you may have experienced in the comments below if it's not included in the list I'm going to share here. So how the necessary adaptations in order to survive narcissistic abuse can often lead to regret. Well, surviving narcissistic abuse as the scapegoated child to a narcissistic parent requires the child to do and not do a lot of things that they would not otherwise choose. Since the child's dependent on the narcissistic parent for a sense of connection, identity, and protection, the child must make that relationship work, I think, no matter what. And no matter what, in the case of a narcissistic parent, means working to keep the narcissistic parent's fragile yet inflated self-worth propped up at all times, while for the child requiring very little emotional nourishment from that parent because it's not available. So the child has to placate the parent while denying their own needs in order to make this relationship work. And here are some common actions survivors have had to take in order to placate the narcissistic parent. So, put the parent's needs first. This can look like dramatic displays of appreciation of the parent in order to bolster the parent's self-esteem. For instance, greeting the narcissistic parent with a big smile when they walk in the door, or agreeing with the narcissistic parent's opinion, no matter what it is, and or trying to kind of preemptively do things around the house that will please the narcissistic parent. For instance, taking out the trash, cooking dinner before they get home, or doing one's homework without fail in order to avoid punishment. Now, of course, these are kind of good deeds a child may do. It's the context in which they're having to do them that I'm talking about here, where the child can feel like there's an or else to doing these sort of good deeds. Like, I need to take the trash out, or else I'll be regarded as a worthless, selfish son or daughter to my parents. So it's done not to kind of contribute, really, but as a means of sort of having to save your hide from someone who can get very retaliatory, vindictive, and punitive if these types of good deeds are not always done on their behalf. So how this can lead to regret? Well, when the survivor of such a narcissistic parent looks back at how they had to placate the parent in order to survive, he or she may cringe at having had to take these measures. They may say things to themselves like, I should have stood up for myself, or I let that parent walk all over me, or, I didn't pull that parent's card when I really should have. And thoughts like these can lead the survivor to feel that disappointment in themselves, which is, I think, the calling card of regret. Another adaptation that can often lead to regret is having to accept blame that wasn't yours. So if a narcissistic parent is angry with you and you happen to have been the scapegoated child, then there's no hope of proving your innocence. Children in such difficult situations grow to learn this early and often in their lives with this narcissistic parent. And when the narcissistic parent is met with that parent's own intolerable feelings of defectiveness or undeservedness, that parent has to expunge those feelings onto the scapegoat child. And of course, the parent does this unconsciously and perceives the child to be the undeserving and defective one in their relationship. From there, the narcissistic parent can easily berate, deride, and devalue the child as the one who deserves such ill will or contempt. And then by locating these intolerable feelings of defectiveness and undeservedness in the scapegoat child, instead of the narcissistic parent themselves, that parent gets to feel a little safer from their own feelings and like they are sort of in control of the feelings. And they do this by influencing the child to identify with these terrible feelings and beliefs so that the parent doesn't have to. So as a result of all this, the child will have the experience of taking the blame for situations that were not the child's fault time and again. That goes back to the sort of or else. The narcissistic parent needs the scapegoat child to serve this sort of psychological function for the parent of keeping these feelings of worthlessness at bay. And the child, sort of, if it wants to have any sense of a shared reality with that parent, must comply. So how this can lead to regret for the child survivor? Well, after surviving such an ordeal, the now adult survivor may look back and feel disappointment in themselves for having assumed blame for situations that were never their fault. They may say things to themselves like, I let my parent get away with blaming me for ruining the day, etc., when I had nothing to do with it. It really wasn't my fault. And here are some common ways survivors have had to emotionally deprive themselves in order to maintain a relationship to the narcissistic parent. First is sacrificing having a fulfilling social life. Most scapegoated children of a narcissistic parent encountered punishment if they sought sources of happiness outside of that parent. A narcissistic parent will often trump up reasons of what the child did or didn't do that meant the child didn't deserve to go see their friends and enjoy a rich social life. So if the child showed enthusiasm towards people outside of the narcissistic parent, then this could wound that narcissistic parent's fragile sense of being special to the child and the only person who matters to that child. The narcissistic parent would then be inclined to try to take these sources of happiness away from the child. So how might this lead to regret for the child survivor? Well, after surviving the relationship to the narcissistic parent, that survivor may find that they missed out on fulfilling friendships and relationships. And the survivor may know that he or she is capable of connecting to others, yet feel aggrieved at having to have withheld themselves from such experiences in the past. So they may say things to themselves like, why did I cut myself off from these people back then? Or I gave in to my narcissistic parent by socially isolating myself like that. And another source of regret for having emotionally deprived themselves is having to thwart their enjoyment of their own abilities as something they had to do to survive the narcissistic parent at the time. Well, at the most basic level, the narcissistic parent wants the scapegoat child to prefer the parent's company and approval to the child's own company and approval of themselves. The parent wants the child to love the parent more than the child loves his or herself. And the parent will often react to acts of self-love by the child with envy and then vindictively retaliate against that child. As such, the scapegoat child must disregard their own skills and talents and really value in order to comply with this mandate. Well, how might this lead to regret for the child survivor? Again, after surviving such an experience, the scapegoat survivor may blame themselves for failing to maximize their potentials. Like, I let my ability as an athlete, a writer, a carpenter, whatever it is, go by the wayside because I was so afraid of what my parent would do to me. And implicit in that is sort of that the survivor shouldn't have, that it's the survivor's fault for having taken this to like an extreme and is therefore a source of regret. Again, what other sources of regret have I missed here? I encourage you to put your own in the comments section below. Well, what's the common thread in all of these sources of regret? I think in every one of these sources, there is the assumption that the survivor could have acted differently. And I would argue that you cannot feel disappointment in yourself or regret unless you assume that a different course of action was possible for you at the time. And I think for a child who comes into this world with the need to have a relationship with a parent or perish, I don't see how the scapegoat child enjoys much or any choice in what they had to do to adapt to the conditions imposed upon them by their narcissistic parent. So why are feelings of regret so common for survivors of narcissistic abuse? Well, I have two ideas about this. The extent of the abuse may have yet to be fully felt, understood, and witnessed. And I cannot overstate how big of an undertaking it is to recognize that the mistreatment you suffered from a narcissistic parent was not your fault. I mean, so much goes into this. Learning about the dynamics of narcissistic psychology is just one of the important ways of doing this. It's also, I think, extremely important to tell someone in your life about what you went through and get to feel believed by that person. And, frankly, it can take a long time before you feel like you're being believed by such, in essence, safe, good people in your life. And I think that the reason is that most times when a survivor tried to tell someone about how they were being treated, they were invalidated by that other parent and or enabling spouse or siblings of the narcissistic parent. So as a result, the very thing that might help the survivor know the abuse was not their fault can also trigger feelings of panic and flight at the anticipation of being disbelieved or invalidated, like one was in the past. So it's a reasonable expectation, I think. The point of all this is to convey just how long it can be before a survivor has the experience of telling someone, being believed by that person and experiencing the fact that this abuse is in the past. And I say experiencing that fact because it's a little different than just the intellectual knowledge at first. Both are important, but the experience of knowing it's over with, I think, is a real outcome of this form of work. And in my experience, until this state of being believed by others is achieved, the survivor can blame themselves for having not acted differently in the face of the abuse. When the full extent of the abuse, I think, is understood and believed by someone else, what typically ensues is a deep feeling of compassion for oneself. And this is not to say that if you feel such feelings of regret that you are not where you should be in recovery. I think this is one of the very common experiences in recovery that often need to be lived through. And if this compassion for yourself for what you went through is not yet accessible, I'd strongly encourage you to try to exercise compassion towards yourself for being wherever you at. And if that involves feeling regret right now, great in a way. So be it. It's such a kind of fancy term here is probably dialectic, but it's like it's like two sides of the same coin. Like both seeing what could be different and having kind of a firm basis of acceptance for wherever you are in your process of recovery. And in essence, kind of being most protective of your sense of morale and working very hard not to feel demoralized, because that can happen in the process of recovery, and is often, the experience of demoralization is often something the scapegoat survivor had to cope with while being abused in this manner. And one way or another, I think the good news is survivors have learned to kind of protect their morale enough to get to this point, because scapegoating abuse is intended, I think, a lot of times to break the will of the person to go on. And for everyone who's gotten to this point, that is a testament to your internal fortitude, resilience, and I think, frankly, toughness. And that's, I think, never to be forgotten along this path. And a resource that can help with this, I think, is my free ebook on surviving narcissistic abuse as a scapegoat, because it arms the reader with theory, research, and some case examples that can let the reader understand that the abuse was really not their fault. Definitely conceptually to begin with, and maybe more. The link is in the comments box below, or you can find it by clicking here. The second idea I'd like to submit here is that feelings of regret may reflect a continued sort of compliance with the belief that one is defective. So having a narcissistic parent is an unnatural state of affairs. Our species wouldn't have survived as it has if most parents were this pathologically self-absorbed. So in the face of such relatively unusual and dire circumstances for the child of such a parent, he or she is going to have to go to some pretty severe lengths in order to survive. I've discussed a lot of these lengths on this channel, but in summary, the child of narcissistic parent is going to likely have to adopt the belief of being defective and or undeserving in order to share reality with the narcissistic parent. Well, everyone uses beliefs to color their perception of the world, others, and themselves. Whether it's a belief in the basic goodness or defectiveness of oneself and others, we really need such beliefs to orient us in life and guide our decisions, kind of let us know what we should expect. So as such, a belief of being defective or undeserving for the scapegoat child of a narcissistic parent is going to inform their view of themselves and the world, often long after the childhood has been survived. So holding oneself responsible for not choosing otherwise in the face of abuse from a narcissistic parent may reflect viewing oneself through that lens of defectiveness. So just as a scapegoat child may have had to believe that their narcissistic parent would not yell and devalue them if they were not so bad, the survivor may blame themselves for not acting otherwise. And this move can subtly take some of the responsibility from the narcissistic parent and attribute more responsibility to the scapegoat child than he or she deserves. So I'm challenging the basis for regret in recovery from narcissistic abuse. I am not challenging the conclusion that the survivor suffered a profound loss in their lives as a result of this abuse. The scapegoat child deserved to be born to, good enough parents who were capable of caring about that child on the child's own terms and finding happiness in the child's pursuit of their own happiness. That just wasn't the case for the survivor of narcissistic abuse. And the survivor suffered as a result. There's no getting around that. The survivor has to come to terms with what they lost as a result of the abuse they suffered. So how can the survivor do this without blaming themselves in a way that leads to regret? Well, as I mentioned, I had a very dear friend who was also a therapist, psychologist, and he liked to distinguish psychological suffering from that which is a part of life and cannot be avoided, from the suffering that results from trying to avoid what is really unavoidable pain. And he called the unavoidable but experienced pain to be clean pain, and the pain that results from trying to avoid unavoidable pain to be dirty pain. I think a survivor's regret towards themselves is a form of dirty pain. However, there is still a source of clean pain that is there to be experienced. In order for the survivor to claim their sense of possibility in their lives today and in their future, the pain of having been denied such a good quality of life as a child, I think must be worked through. That clean pain can be just cleanly experienced. For one reason or another, the ability to reclaim one's full quality of life today seems to correlate with one's willingness to admit and grieve the loss of happiness that happened throughout one's childhood. And for this experience of clean pain or grief to be a healing one, I think it can be very important to share such feelings and feel understood with and by someone else. And as these feelings are met and lived through, something else often happens. Possibility becomes something that may be felt, not just thought about. A sense of liking oneself may also, again, slowly and incrementally emerge. So the survivor may begin to look inward for direction in their lives rather than having to react to what's happening on the outside so much. And of course, these are great outcomes for the survivor, but they can also be surprising because they happen can happen at least, one of the ways, after surrendering to the sadness of what was lost earlier in life. As the survivor feels supported in the fact of that loss in and within current safe relationships, then this sort of newness becomes possible. Well, I really want to thank the commenter YouTube Google for bringing this topic to my and our attention, and hope that you found today's video useful in your own process. And I want to again just thank you all for your continued engagement and support of this channel. And look forward to posting again next Friday, 9 a.m. Pacific time. Take care.